Good morning and Shabbat Shalom. I'm excited to be back and really looking forward to my Sabbath rest this week. This Shabbat is special because we're finishing up the book of Genesis and getting ready to head into Exodus. And so essentially this portion deals with the death of the patriarch Jacob and the blessing of his sons before he dies. And in speaking about his sons, the portion actually starts out with him adopting two more sons. And these would be the sons of Joseph. And I'm just going to read the account to you so you can orient yourself and get into the context of what we're talking about. So this is chapter 48, verse 5. And Joseph has brought his two sons to visit his father Jacob. And Jacob is speaking to Joseph. And he says, "Now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, shall be mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be no less than Reuben and Simeon. But progeny born to you after them shall be yours. They shall be recorded instead of their brothers in their inheritance." And so I find this really interesting. This is a theme that we've seen before. But I think probably the most obvious connection is the adoption of Yeshua by Joseph, because it wasn't his biological blood-born son. But then you kind of have this also the adoption of Yeshua by the Father, because he's a human being, God in human form. And so this is kind of I see this as a foreshadowing of that, but I find it so significant. The phrase that they will be his sons no less than Reuben and Simeon, which are his two firstborn sons. So very, very interesting here. And the other thing, and this is going to sound so tired because I know I bring it up every week, but now it's really starting to get curious to me, is that up until this point, he's referred to as Jacob. That's his name when he was born. That's the name he was given by his parents. But in verse 8, we see the name switch again. So this is what it says. Noticing Joseph's sons, Israel asked, "Who are these?" So I had one commentator bring up an interesting point, which was maybe the differences speaking about being in the land or not being in the land. I'm not sure what the connection with the land here could be. Maybe there is some deeper spiritual significance. But I think there's something here with the names that I'm missing. Or maybe I'm just reading into it too much. I don't know. But I think something that obvious as the name switching probably has something behind it. So I'm really, really curious now, and that's something I'm going to probably start seeking out and studying a bit more. But this actually brings us really just into the right into the next point I wanted to make, which was Jacob, or Israel, just got done telling Joseph that his sons are going to be like his own. He's adopting his sons, and in fact, Joseph is to not even count them in his blessings and give an inheritance for his sons. And so his thirdborn would now be his firstborn. And so it's interesting because Israel asks, "Who are these?" And Joseph's response is, "They are my sons, whom God has given me here." So again, not sure what the significance of that is. I don't know if Joseph was hesitant to allow the adoption, or if it was just that's what he's used to saying, or if it's an acknowledgement of, "Here's my sons and I'm bringing them to you now, and they will be your sons once you bless them," or maybe it's something else altogether, but something that I just found interesting. Now, this is another one that we have been familiar with, we've heard before. It ties with the themes of the second born or the lesser born being the child of promise. We've seen it with Isaac, who was actually the second born, firstborn of Rebekah though. We see it with Joseph, who wasn't the second born, he was second to last born, yet he gets the bigger blessing and the inheritance, and it's through him that the children of Israel are born. We see it again here with his sons Ephraim and Manasseh. And so let's start reading in verse 12. It says, "Joseph then removed them," his children, "from his knees and bowed low with his face to the ground. Joseph took the two of them, Ephraim with his right hand to Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand to Israel's right, and brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger." In other words, he's the second born. and his left hand on Manasseh's head, thus crossing his hands, although Manasseh was the firstborn. Um, and so, and later we find that Joseph is trying to say, hey, Dad, wait, you're doing this wrong. He's like, no, I know what I'm doing. But there's a little bit of a foreshadowing of this, that Jacob already, he knows what's going on, because up above, we've read this before in verse 5, it says, your 2 sons shall be mine, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so here he actually lists Ephraim first before Manasseh, even though Manasseh is the firstborn. So he's already acknowledging that Ephraim comes first, and he does it here when he crosses his hands to give the blessing. And what I found really kind of cool about this was that it's the location of the children. And so although Ephraim is at Jacob's left, or Israel's left, as it says here in the scripture, he has the right hand on his head. And so this just made me think of Yeshua, being at the right hand of the Father. We see it in scripture a lot where it talks about his strong right hand, which will save us. Righteousness and salvation comes from the right hand. And so all of this is just really strong evidence and support for the fact that in this case, it is going to be Ephraim who's the firstborn and receives the firstborn blessing from Jacob, or Israel. And so let's see. He gives the blessing. I just didn't write down the verse. Here we go. Okay, verse 20. So he gives the blessing to Ephraim and Manasseh, and in verse 20 it says, so he blessed them that day, saying, by you, Israel, shall invoke blessings, saying, God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. And just reading this more simply, you're probably thinking, okay, he's putting Ephraim first. Obviously, I mean, everything we've seen up until this point indicates that Ephraim comes first. Ephraim's the firstborn. But I was curious, and I wanted to see if there was some deeper meaning to the word before. And so I looked it up in the Hebrew, and the word there is panim. And one of the definitions certainly can mean in front of, like in front of, in line, order, chronologically, etc., which is the meaning that we are most familiar with. But it also means face or presence. And the definition, when it says face here, it's clarified as the part that turns. And so I find this really, really interesting, is that it's Ephraim's presence, or his face, that is in front of Manasseh, and he's turning maybe his face towards Manasseh as the firstborn. I've heard this type of allegory or imagery in other situations. I think probably the best one that I can remember is the father in the burning bush before Moshe, and it's talking about his face or his presence being there in the bush. So I'm not sure what the deeper significance of this is yet, but I think there's something there, and I just found it very, very interesting that that's the Hebrew word that's used here for the English word that's been translated as before. Now, in verse 49, chapter 2, again, another interesting play on the Jacob versus Israel verbiage. And what it says here is, what's happened is that now that Jacob has blessed the sons of Joseph, and he actually blesses Joseph in here too, or at least it says that he's blessing Joseph, but what he's actually talking about is Joseph's sons. So I find that interesting. The blessing of the sons is kind of belonging to the father as well. But here he's calling the rest of his sons to bless them and to tell them what's going to happen in the coming days, because he knows he's about to die. And what he says is, assemble and hearken, O sons of Jacob, hearken to Israel your father. So when he's addressing the sons, they're identified as sons of Jacob. But when he's addressing himself as the father, he's addressing himself as Israel. And so just to remind myself what these words meant, I kind of looked them up. And sons of Jacob, the word for sons here could be defined as builder of the family name. And so it's more conceptual. When I looked up father, it was just a title. It was like, he's a father, he's the father of progeny. And so it seems to me like the name they would want to carry on would actually be the name of Israel, because if you remember, Jacob means supplanter, whereas Israel is God prevails. So I'm not sure why that is here, but it's interesting that it's the conceptual meaning of the word versus the actual legitimate real meaning of the word, like father being a father. So that was an interesting thing that I found there, the builder of the family name. Now we start to get into the blessings of the sons, and some of them are much more in depth than others. And one of the in-depth larger blessings or prophecies that we see is for Simeon and Levi. And if you remember, they two went out together and they slew all the men after the rape of their sister, Dinah. So they had convinced the men of that city to become circumcised and agreed that if they did that, then they would allow the Israelite women to intermarry. And while they were in the pain of their circumcision, they went out and killed them all. And so this is the context for this blessing that we see. And one thing that really stuck out to me was Jacob is saying that their weapons are tools of lawlessness. Really interesting, because it's the tribe of Levi from which descended the priests. And they are the ones who are actually the purgers of lawlessness. Through their daily sacrifice and through the sin sacrifices, they're cleaning the altar. They're purging the altar of the sins of Israel so that God can continue to dwell in the presence of his people. He can't dwell in the presence of sin. So their work in the temple is incredibly important. And I found it very interesting that the son, Levi, who kind of was promoting, if that's the right word, lawlessness, is now promoting lawfulness and cleaning up the result of lawlessness. Is that why he was given the job of priesthood? Because he had to essentially clean up the mess he made? I don't know. And why him versus Simeon? Well, Levi's name means joined to. And through the sacrifices and through the purging of the altar, we can be joined to God. And so I think there really is a greater significance there, with Levi being the one that eventually led to the priesthood because of the meaning of his name. Now, the other interesting blessing, and I've mentioned Dan before, because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with Dan, such as him being missing from the list in Revelation among the 12 sons, with Manasseh and Ephraim being included. But in verse 17, I just want to read it to you. I'll start at verse 16. I'll read the whole blessing. It's short. Dan shall govern his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Okay. Dan shall be a serpent by the road, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heel so that his rider is thrown backward. And this brought me straight back to Genesis, when the serpent is being described. This is after the sin, right? Where Adam and Eve have eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and God proclaims the curse now on them and on the serpent for deceiving them. And essentially what the prophecy that was given is that the serpent will try to bite men's heels, but the man will crush the serpent's head with his heel. And this is exactly what I thought of here. And Dan is the tribe that went into idolatry. He's not included in the book of Revelation because of that sin, or at least that's what I believe at this point, and that's what a lot of the Jewish scholars will say as well as to why he's not included, because Dan was the first tribe that essentially left the Father and followed after idolatry. Now, what's really interesting here is you have blessings of 12 sons, and throughout, from the very beginning, it just goes straight from one to the other, from one son to the other, to the other, to the other. But before we move from Dan to Gad, we have this insert phrase that says, I will wait for your deliverance, O Lord. And I think this definitely is prophetic, as the general concept of Dan brings me back to Revelation. This here too does. And so is this one of those amazing secrets that is God's delight to hide and the honor of men to find out? I don't think it's a coincidence that it comes right after Dan. And so I think there's much more that can be read here is essentially the entire story of Israel. How often have people strayed after false gods, strayed away from their God, and then they cry out to the Father and they wait for his deliverance. Of course, the most obvious example is Egypt. They spent time in Egypt. They forgot their God, Yahweh. They followed after Egyptian gods, but then they cried out to him, and he delivered them from Egypt and from idolatry, to purge them and clean them in the wilderness and allow them to be in his presence again. And so, very cool revelation here. I'm really excited that I found it. So the other thing that was interesting was the blessing on Joseph, which he does give. Joseph's blessing is pretty long. And in his blessing is the only time we see mention of a personal attention or personal relationship with God. So I just want to read it. It says, his arms were made firm by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. There, the shepherd, the rock of Israel, the God of your father who helps you, and Shaddai who blesses you with blessings of heaven above. And again, it's through Joseph that we see essentially the entire prophecy of Israel and the salvation of Israel and the coming together of the two branches, Ephraim and Manasseh, the Gentiles, and what we know today as the Jews. So very interesting, very cool, makes complete sense. I don't necessarily point out things like this because I haven't seen them before. I point them out because they're so exciting, because they just prove the existence and the greatness of our Father and his wisdom and his kindness and his glory and his majesty. And every time I find something like this, it's like, yeah, I already knew that, but here's another support for it that I didn't see like this before. And it's not surprising that it's there, but it's very exciting that it's there, because it just makes me love him and believe in him so much more. And so that's why I point these things out. Okay, so moving on. There's another interesting type of prophetic story around the death and burial of Jacob when he does die. And the first thing that struck me as interesting was verse 5 of chapter 50. Jacob has died, and Joseph is speaking to Pharaoh, and what he says is, let me go up and bury my father, then I shall return. And this really made me think ahead to future portions where Moshe is asking Pharaoh to let them go up out of Egypt. It's the same type of phraseology. In this case, Pharaoh says, go up and bury your father. As we know, in Moshe's case, different Pharaoh, that didn't happen. He didn't allow them to go up and worship their God. So in both cases here, we see Israel exiting Egypt. We see a petition for the Israelites or the Hebrews to leave Egypt because of their father. In the first case, they're mourning the death of their father. In the second case, they want to worship their father, the Father above all fathers, God, Yahweh. And what we see in verse 7 is a lot of people go out to mourn the death of Jacob. Joseph goes up. It says, with him went up all the officials of Pharaoh, the senior members of his court, all of Egypt's dignitaries, together with all of Joseph's household, his brothers, his father's household. In fact, there's such a large crowd that when the Canaanite inhabitants see the mourning of this group of people, they're saying that this is a really solemn mourning on the part of the Egyptians. And so it's clear that it's the entire nation that's mourning. And in the Exodus from Egypt, when the Israelites leave, again, it's a huge exit of a lot of people. And it's not just the Israelites that go. Israelites go as well. Egyptians go as well. Any Egyptian that obeyed the command to put the blood on their doorpost or was in the household with an Israelite who had the blood on their doorpost would have been saved and would have exited. Pharaoh goes as well with his chariots. In this case, as a friend, to mourn the death of Jacob. In the latter case, of course, in pursuit to try to bring them back. Very cool, very interesting. This is something that I hadn't seen before, this foreshadowing and this parallel of this exodus out of Egypt to mourn the death of Jacob was temporary. They went back afterwards, but it foreshadowed exactly what he prophesied to them would happen before he died. And so what we see later, sorry, I think I said that wrong. It's not Jacob that prophesies, it's Joseph that prophesies it, because in this portion, both Jacob and Joseph die. And so that's actually what I'm going into next. Verse 24 says, "At length Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die." This made me wonder, was he the first one of the brothers to die? Certainly he wasn't the last, so because it says brothers, plural. But I'm not sure if he was the first to die. Why? Interesting. What's the significance of that? He was the second youngest. Benjamin was the only one who was younger than him. And so why did he have such a short lifespan compared to some of his other brothers? But what's even more important is what he says next. "God will surely take notice of you and bring you up from this land to the land that he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And so here's the prophecy of the Exodus that's happening, I don't know how long after, but chronologically after their exodus out to bury their father Jacob. And what he says here, he's making them swear, "When God has taken notice of you, you shall carry up my bones from here." And then later, when the Exodus account happens, we do see that care is taken to say that, yes, his bones were carried out. And so with Jacob's death, what we see is they leave, and he leaves the land. He doesn't stay in Egypt. He's buried outside of the land. He's buried in the cave that Abraham bought, and where his fathers were buried, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah. He buried Leah there. But Joseph stays in Egypt. He dies, he's embalmed, and he waits for the Exodus to go out. And I think that's really significant. I think it's important that Joseph went out with the rest of the Israelites for the Exodus, because it's important for the prophecy and the parallels with Messiah, and ultimately what it means for our salvation and our ability to be in God's presence again for eternity. And so it ends with a bang, the book of Genesis. But again, I'm not surprised. This is the wisdom of our Father, Yahweh. And it really is just exciting when he gives little old me revelations like this. And I know it happens to you. It happens to everybody. And I just find it so amazing when he decides to do that. We're humans. What do we do? But I think he takes joy in revealing these things to us. And I take joy in it for sure. As I said earlier, it just puts me in greater awe of him. So that is the end of of Genesis. Next week we're going to be starting in Exodus. So this prophecy that we end off on is going to come true, and we're going to see exactly how it comes to bear. So Shabbat Shalom. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next week.